We are punished by our sins, not for them. This statement, although attributed to the American writer Elbert Hubbard, has a much older origin, with its roots going as far back as the Bible. In essence, the meaning of this quote is that we are not punished directly by an external being, i.e. some higher power, when we fall into sinful behaviour, but rather we face the repercussions internally as a consequence of the immorality of the action itself. In my opinion, doing the right thing because of an internal conflict rather than over the fear of being condemned by a higher power is a greater moral victory. In other words, it is more remarkable to avoid sin simply because it is the right thing over an obligation from above which compels us to act a certain way. When we remove fear from the equation, we can now make moral decisions authentically. We will also be better at identifying which negative habits are still guiding our decisions under the surface. If living authentically is the goal, how can we get there? Well, first, we need to realise how corrupting it is to live inauthentically. The British novelist George Orwell said it best. It is a corrupting thing to live one's real life in secret. One should live with the stream of life, not against it. However, shaking yourself out of this corruptive, inauthentic state of mind is easier said than done, as oftentimes you become normalised to your behaviour. This realisation is found in the French philosopher Albert Camus' book The Plague, observing that the effect of living through an epidemic is that after a while you could get used to anything. Likewise, with our negative habits, we may not see how it is negatively harming us because the feeling has been so normalised by our memorisation of the environment we are in. So how do we fix this? Step 1, you need to think bigger than your internal environment. It is important to think greater than your internal environment, as this on its own is not the full picture. If you don't, the next time you experience the inverse of your ingrained belief, you will be reactive and unprepared and may get swept up by an emotional response. We will then revert back to our old behaviour, which our brain already is used to. So without looking past our internal environment, no room is left to consider a different perspective with an open mind. Step 2. Refrain from announcing publicly how you view yourself. This step may sound familiar if you're aware of the writer Don Miguel Ruiz's The Four Agreements, whose first agreement is to be impeccable with your word. Our word is so consequential because as soon as we say we are a certain way, a self-fulfilling prophecy will begin to form. There's a famous joke that you may have heard that is apt, one of my dad's favourites. I used to be indecisive, now I'm not so sure. For example, by saying you are an impatient person, you will initiate a self-fulfilling prophecy where you will become defeatist and impatient moments will crop up in any future actions until it becomes part of your personality. To use another example, if you proclaim to others that you can't concentrate when reading a book and can barely finish a page, you will be less inclined to disprove this statement, and so your defeatist attitude stunts any potential for progress. Besides, it is much easier to dwell on your past failures than it is to disprove your firmly held beliefs. Internally, when we remember things from the past, chemicals are released in the brain that make us feel good. When we dwell on memories too much, we will be too fixated on the past that we will believe it, as our body can't tell the difference between what is real and what is a memory. Reminiscing about the good old days can be even more appealing when we're in a static point in life. If nothing new is happening to stimulate your feelings, you can just reaffirm yourself by rehashing the past. Our beliefs are formed by our past experiences, and our brain is the database, recording them with our most valued beliefs being the most memorised, i.e. the most thought about. What makes this problematic is if these beliefs go unchecked, i.e. they're not verified by an external source. Memories are unreliable at best and may even be a complete fabrication, filling in the gaps of the reality with an inflated story that either makes us look good if we have a holier-than-thou persona, or makes us appear worse if we are in a crisis of self-esteem. Moreover, shifting our identity only becomes harder as we get older, with studies indicating that by age 35 our identity is so solidified that our feelings and thought associations are hardwired. By this age, 95% of our behaviours are formed of unconscious autopilots. The Greek philosopher Epictetus advised against this proclamation of intention, asserting that if you want to appear a certain way, appear to yourself and that should suffice. Or as Carl Jung said, you are what you do, not what you say you'll do. We must therefore stop vocalising on what type of person we think we are and be content with living in accordance with the best thing in us, based on the principles we deem productive, stripping ourselves of the negative habits that make us regress in favour of more productive habits which encourage growth. Of course, this can't happen overnight, and you can't just change a thought the next day and expect your brain to abide by the new outlook straight away. Ideas alone lead us to nowhere, but with action following from ideas, we are able to align ourselves with the person we want to be. As Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, said, we must be consistent with our thoughts and actions. It is only until you condition your body consistently to feel a different way that you can begin to shift your negative habits into positive habits. If your brain hasn't memorized a new action, you are likely to revert back to the old autopilot that is more ingrained in your brain. Therefore, if you hope to reprogram your brain, you must pay constant attention of when you are on a negative path. Think of it as a retrieval process, observing negative patterns so you can classify which ones are detrimental and subsequently rise above them. As Carl Jung writes, constant observation pays the unconscious a tribute that more or less guarantees its cooperation. This can be likened to a muscle which requires constant training and attention in the interest of maintenance and development. In other words, if you need to tear the muscle to grow it, likewise mentally you need to dig through your own behaviours and find which loops are negatively affecting you. Only then can you start to forget an unproductive emotion and introduce a different pathway. Observation doesn't always guarantee an accurate assessment. Another complication that makes this self-analysis tricky is how difficult it is to self-diagnose your feelings with words. When we use language to describe a feeling, we struggle to give it an accurate explanation, yet in our minds we believe it to be objective. Language is in the realm of the brain, whereas feeling is the language of the body. So when we describe a feeling, we are activating two different areas and merging them together, inevitably causing some contradictions along the way. Moreover, just because we feel a certain way, it doesn't mean that it is the reality of the situation, because there may be aspects we are missing when we decide on an opinion and the emotion surrounding it. Asking the right prompts is a more reliable approach. Asking prompts in situations when you find yourself in a negative feedback loop can help snap you out of the pattern you are in. As mentioned with our internal environment, we can be ignorant of a different perspective because we haven't considered it as being viable. To use an analogy of a room, think of a negative behaviour that you are having as the result of being confined to a single room. The reason you can't think differently is because you have not considered another option. What if you walked forwards into another room? This analogy demonstrates the importance of prompts in the moment so as to prevent self-entrapment and instead turning around to notice that the walls are not closed in on you and you can escape from the room. In other words, when you give less attention to the negative behaviour, only then can you begin to unmemorize an emotion, and only then can you liberate energy that is needed for a new pattern to form. This brings us back full circle to the quote I began with, which is a misconception we cling on to. We are punished by our sins, not for having them. When we play the victim and believe that we get punished by an external force, it is a personal reality that we put ourselves in. Life is in fact a state of mind, and the knowledge we hold is the result of what is most memorized. Over time, this becomes wisdom which, if productive, can help us rise above the game and change the situation entirely. It is only with this continued awareness and consideration of new options with an open mind that we can start to break free from the judgment that what we are has already been decided and we are powerless to change. If we instead refuse this conclusion and keep observing and re-observing these patterns of behaviour, only then can we begin to change our behaviour for the better. Thanks for watching.